Okay. I turn the AC off so you guys can actually hear me a little bit today. Alright, welcome back. Welcome to the Writestream. So today, what we're going to be talking about is a couple of character archetypes that occur quite a bit in fantasy and horror, and everything else that you happen to want to talk about. The archetypes ought not take too long to actually discuss, but I thought it'd be a good opportunity to just kind of hop in and talk about some types of characters that you see a lot in horror and fantasy, and how they function and what their character arcs tend to look like. That is their growth, where their trajectory as a character. So hopefully you guys are having a great day. Let's take a look here. We already have a super chat from Scott. Thank you. Suggestion: series of live streams where you said reread chapters of your books. I know it's cynical, but I'd listen and pay, assuming the hours made sense. I would totally do that, or maybe have that as part of each live stream, something like that. The only thing about that, there's a couple things with that. So, the first one is I'm afraid that people will find it boring, right? The second one is, depending on how I do things in the future, you're looking at some exclusivity issues, right? So I had this when I made the Garamesh and the Farmer audiobook, is that I posted it on YouTube just so people could read it for free, and you can still read it there now. But at the time, there was like an Amazon exclusive thing going on with that, so I could have lost, access to Kindle Unlimited. Of course, now I don't do Kindle Unlimited at all, and I can tell you exactly why I don't do Kindle Unlimited. But so you kind of run into that, because that's a portion of the book. So if you have, if you're in Kindle Unlimited and you're reading your book online, that's technically posting more than, that's posting a portion of the book, and I think you can only post up to 10%. So if you have a 20 chapter book, that's 2 chapters, right? Now, right now, I don't do Amazon exclusive stuff. That doesn't mean I won't ever do it in the future. So I may do it in the future, depending on how things end up working out, shaking out, especially now that Barnes & Noble has been acquired. So that's actually a news topic that I'll talk about for a little bit, which is Barnes & Noble got acquired by a hedge fund. And what does that mean for the future of books? Well, it means possibly that depending on what they do with Barnes & Noble, it means that a trad publishing, traditional publishing, is going to have to go through like a major revision of its business practices. Now, it's been needing to do that for a while, but it's resisted it on a couple of different fronts. So one of the things that they have resisted is selling ebooks at a price below the cost of a paperback. Here's Godzilla. This Godzilla's from Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, by the way. A paperback, I think you can get this for $5, right? The ebook's 99 cents because the ebook contains none of the cost of this. There's no paper, there's no printing. You have to pay for the capital of the machine that turns the words into a book that you can hold, right? So to me, it makes sense that you will always sell a digital product at a reduction of the price of a physical product, depending on how much the cost of a physical product is. So like with Needle Ash, the ebook's like $2.99 or $3.99. The paperback is like $10.99. And maybe more depending if you're getting it on Barnes & Noble. Everything's more expensive on Barnes & Noble for whatever reason. Like it goes through the distribution chain, and it's like $17 on Barnes & Noble, which is actually the price of a normal trade paperback. This size is like $15, $16, sometimes more. So that's not wildly out of it, but it's cheaper on Amazon. But this has a huge amount of cost associated with it that really doesn't need to be passed on to the consumer if you don't want this physical product. So they've been resisting that. And so one of the things they did, Amazon wanted to price all the ebooks at $9.99. And this was a big issue a couple years ago. And they got sued. There was lawsuits and all kinds of other stuff going down with this $10.99 price or $9.99 price point. Because what the big publishers wanted to do is they wanted to sell their books their ebooks at the same price that they sell their physical copies for. They want to emphasize the physical copy. And you're looking at it, you're like, why on earth would you emphasize a physical copy? There's a cost of printing, there's a cost of distribution, cost of shipping, the cost to lay out the text. You got to pay somebody to engrave the text, to do the interior layout. There's a huge amount of cost that goes into printing a physical book. Why on earth would you want people to buy the physical copy over the digital copy? And in fact, even today, I tend to buy the physical copies of, the big 5 books. And here's Twilight, which I've done some content on. I'll probably do some more content on it to talk about what's in this little young adult vampire romance thing. You don't have to like it to try to figure out what's in it. It was cheaper to buy the paperback than to buy an ebook. An ebook I might have preferred simply because I can search through it faster. But it's still, the physical copy is emphasized. The physical copy was like $10. The ebook was like $10. Might as well get the book too. And then that way, when I'm done with it, I can give it to someone else or donate it to a bookstore or something. So we've had this thing where they've been emphasizing people buying physical copies. Well, it has to do with a big tax scam that a lot of people don't know about with big publishers. So what big publishers do is they print up a bunch of copies of a book based on a bunch of different things, what they hope they can sell. Because there's an economy of scale. To print, let's say you want to print 5,000 copies of a book, it costs maybe $5 a book to print 5,000 copies. If you print 10,000 copies, because you've already created all the plates. If you're doing, I don't think most publishers do plate engraving anymore, but you've set up all the setup to bind it and to print the jackets and everything. It ends up costing like $2 a copy to make 10,000. You get incrementally, it gets better. So you just print the maximum amount that you hope to sell. And anything that they don't sell at the bookstore, because of the way most bookstores operate, they operate on a weird credit system where they send the book and you don't actually get the payment until they've sold it, but then there's a weird credit agreement. A lot of parts stores work that way, by the way, is that they actually buy the parts on credit, meaning when the part is sitting on the shelf, it's accruing interest until you sell it, which is why if you're not turning your parts over 4 times a year, you're probably doing something wrong with your parts selling, or you're ordering the wrong parts. Anyway, that's a total aside. I used to sell truck parts and refrigeration parts years ago. Anyway, so if a copy isn't sold, if there's unsold copies sitting in Barnes & Noble, they can either put them on clearance or anything else that they don't want to sell. They take the jacket off and send it back to the publisher, and it gets written off as a lost or destroyed copy. So the publisher destroys the extra copies at a loss. So what this means is that any extra copy of a book that they don't sell, they get a tax write-off for. So they're encouraged through the tax system to print more books than they can sell, and they get essentially rewarded for inefficiencies. So any inherent inefficiency that exists because they're printing too many books, too many of the wrong book, or the market doesn't want the book that they printed, ends up, basically becoming a wash for them at the worst. So that, of course, they want to emphasize the physical book because that's where all the tax money is, so to speak. That's where the biggest optionality is. If people are buying ebooks, then that makes it so that printing 10,000 regular books and getting tax write-offs for not selling them all, that's not as encouraging. And of course, if you sell all 10,000, then you've made even more money. So it's kind of like a win-win for them. So a lot of people don't realize this. So what Nagelsack says is fixed costs plus variable costs equals immediate total cost. So corporate book burning encouraged by the state, absolutely. So they literally do burn the books. They shred them and then they get incinerated to make sure that you can't sell them. So the practical-minded people are like, well, there's all these books that people don't want. Couldn't they donate them to libraries? It's like they could, but they won't, because they don't get money for doing that. They get money for destroying the books. So anyway. If Barnes & Noble gets significantly altered, if it gets its business model significantly altered, and it's been having trouble the last few years for a whole bunch of reasons. The main one is they haven't figured out how to equate physical books, and they don't know how to deal with the physical book ebook competition, like the inner competition of it. Gaming industry already figured it out, more or less. But the gaming industry didn't have as much of a problem because a $60 game, the cost of producing a physical copy is such a smaller portion, especially with the disc. Discs are way cheaper to make than books still. So, the cost of making a Blu-ray disc for Dragon Quest XI, probably with the batch that they do, it's probably like $1. So to sell a physical copy versus a digital copy, the loss is just so much less that it just doesn't matter in games. But in books, it actually does matter. So depending on how that shakes out, that's going to be they're going to have to really, they're going to be in deep water if you're in a big publisher. And if you are a trad published author and you're with a publisher that's struggling, there's also going to be complications, because if that publisher stops printing the book, if the book basically goes out of print, recovering your rights to publish the book with another publisher is not always the easiest thing. I've done some video on the novels of Gore, how essentially the rights to publication were held on out of spite for years. It threatens the livelihood of a lot of authors, not just the publishers. Because if the publishing house folds, they still hold the rights to publishing, and that will actually get sold off at bankruptcy, because it's like publishing rights, like any IP law, they're considered an asset, so you can sell them off to another publisher. That's my understanding. Don't take that as like a legal thing, but it could be very complicated for authors that are in traditional publishing. Likewise, it could be complicated for indie authors, because you may be used to selling a lot of books through the Nook platform, even though it's much less popular than the Amazon platform. Like, what does that mean? Well, the Nook platform becomes something different. How do you adjust your sales strategy from there? But I think the biggest impact is going to be trad publishers. So anyway, that's the news. Any personal news for me? If you're not on the mailing list, you should get on the mailing list if you want the free book. Let me show the... Can I show the... Oh, I don't have it queued up right now. Anyway, you guys should have seen the cover a while back. I'm going to go ahead and chat, and in chat I'm going to post a link if you're not on the mailing list. This will take you to where you can download the book in whatever format you want, including PDF, and it'll put you on the mailing list. And that's it. And so if you're already on the mailing list, you should have gotten it. If you're on the mailing list and you didn't get it, just send me an email, and I'll try to get you a copy. So I'm just giving this one away free to everybody who watches the channel or who's on the mailing list. And my hope is that people will, if you like this kind of horror, then that's cool, and you can like that, and I can get some idea of the popularity of this with my audience before I go any further. But eventually it'll go up on all the major platforms, and people can buy it and review it and things like that. But for right now, I just kind of want to see what my current audience thinks about it, because it's something very different from what I've done. Usually I do just straight up fantasy, and now this one, it happens to be like horror, and gory horror at that. So I'm just not sure what people will think about it, but I still like to put stuff out and see what people think. I'm sure it won't be for everyone, but that's okay. Let's read a couple to chat, and then I'll see if I can get to talking about the subject today, and then we can just have a chat before we go. Let me think if there's any other news while I'm reading this. I haven't thought of too much. The big publishing news is Barnes & Noble getting bought by a hedge fund. Hedge funds tend to, when they take a company private, they tend to spin off different parts of the company for profit. Okay. Let's see here. The conspiracy theorist reminds me of the most common villain trope done wrong, the secret society. Yeah, so I'll talk about the conspiracy theorist here. Don't worry. Sure, the hero destroyed most of our assets and agents and exposed us to the public, but don't worry. It's all part of the plan. Did you change your microphone setup? The audio in your previous video sounds different. Yes. So what happened was, I have a 3-year-old, and he came in, and he turned all the dials. So sometimes I don't realize he's turned the dials, and I start it back up, and I realize my recording volume is too low, so I have to go back and try to adjust all my preamp settings and everything. Excuse me. And then they aren't right, so I pumped it up a little bit too loud, so there's some distortion. I'm also, have a chest cold since last week that I'm still getting over, so That's distorting my voice a little bit on its own, but it's not too bad. It's not too bad from the mic's perspective, I should say. Scotland O, maybe just record the first few chapters. I personally listen to videos, podcasts, and live streams all day long. I don't read books. I haven't tried, so recordings make sense. Yeah, makes sense. Let's see here. Excuse me. Now the game publishers don't want to make discs anymore. The new Fallout 76 packages have a round paper disc with a code on it to download the game. Ooh, I don't like that. Let me talk about this for a minute. So there's actually a video that's going to come out tomorrow where I will talk about this in relation to Google Stadia. But the big thing is, if you have a physical copy of a disc and the physical copy actually contains the game, and that's not necessarily the case for stuff right now, but if the physical copy contains the game, you got to think in 10, 20 years, how are you going to access that content you paid for? How are you going to play the game that you bought? So on a Super Nintendo or a Nintendo, you can put the game cartridge in and it works. It still works 30 years later. You can play your old 8-bit Nintendo games or your Atari games. They all work. So there's no loss of what you paid for as long as you keep hold of the hardware. Nintendo hardware has lasted very long. It's surprising how long the original NES has lasted. But you can hold on to that hardware and hold on to your games. You can still play them. PlayStation 1, you can still put in a disc and play the game. You could play Final Fantasy VII on your PlayStation or Final Fantasy IX. PlayStation 2, same thing. My GameCube stuff still works. PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 on, you start to get a thing where the disc contains the game, but it's immediately patched. So it doesn't contain all the DLC. There's things like DLC, but also the game's immediately patched so that if you were to put the disc in a different Xbox 360 10 years from now, would you actually be able to play the game or not? It's not actually certain. It depends on the game. But the loss of a physical copy really makes that a worry, because okay, I bought the digital and I buy digital games. It's like I have a bunch of Steam games. If I buy the digital copy of a game, will I be able to play it in 10 years? Will I even be able to launch Steam on this computer in 10 years? Like, Steam doesn't really work on Windows XP machines anymore, I don't think. So if you were playing some older game on Windows XP when Steam came out, can you even play it anymore? I don't know. So that's a really worrisome thing. I personally long for the days when you bought a game, you got the game, you got the whole game. There wasn't any DLC, there wasn't anything. It was the game. The game was on the disc or the game was on the cartridge. You put it in and you played the game. Constant patching, patching exists because the development cycle is actually too short. They figured out it's more efficient to kind of free up programming resources in between games to do that kind of stuff. But I don't like it. I miss one of the things I liked about last time I played. One of the things I liked about playing Final Fantasy 13 was that the whole game was there. You just played the game. It wasn't a bunch of DLC. If I can get away with this is something from Bernard Ebanks. If I can get away with paperbacks or hardcovers, I will. Spent so much time reading physical copies that it just doesn't feel the same. I prefer physical copies in general, but they take up a lot of space. So one of the things I do is if I read a book and I don't think I'm going to reread it, I get rid of the book. I either give it away or I donate it or I sell it to a used bookstore. I'll have a lot of books, but I have way less books than I've read because I just get rid of physical copies. They just sit on a shelf. And if I've read a book twice, then I know that I'm probably going to read it a third time, and I keep it. Old textbooks, just throw those away. They're outdated, especially if they're like medical or anything like that. Kaku says, I would reserve physical when merits more meaning to me. Yeah, digital part of a catalog to share on mass, compete for the physical spot. Yeah, so physical books mean more. Obviously, a really cool edition of Lord of the Rings is something that you'll hold on to, maybe even pass down to somebody else. And if you have, like I said, if I have a physical copy of a book, when I'm done with it, if I don't think I'm going to read it again, I can just give it to someone else. Just be like, hey, you want to read Twilight? Here you go. Just take my copy, right? Cool. and then they don't have to spend money on it, and I've rid myself of something that takes up physical space. I got rid of a bunch of my CDs. I got rid of almost all my CDs like 4 or 5 years ago. Partly because they were taking up a lot of space, but also because I was like, oh yeah, in the future we're not going to do any physical media. And part of me actually regrets that. I don't actually have a CD player hooked up to a stereo. I only have vinyl. But I'm like, if I want a physical copy, I'll do vinyl. And that's kind of where I've settled into. If I want a physical copy, it's vinyl. Otherwise, I'm okay listening to digital because CD players are cumbersome. And if I really want to, I could always burn a disc and like put it in my truck or whatever. Brennan says, I got on your list a few days ago, started reading Voice of the Void and got hooked by the image created in the first sentence. I don't remember what the first sentence was. What was the first sentence? What did I say? Andrew walked down the gallery, watching the slowly bobbing reflection on the waxed floor from the bright artificial windows to his left. I thought about like having something that goes before that, like some song lyrics. But okay, cool. I'm glad that hooked your attention. I was actually worried about that. I'm like, I'm just gonna begin. But the first paragraph kind of describes an empty corridor. I'll tell you how I came up with that. So the first scene in the little book there was actually a dream I had. I had a dream the week after my daughter was born. I had this dream, and I was walking through like a space colony, and it was an empty school, and it was extremely creepy, and it woke me up, and I couldn't go back to sleep because like everyone was missing, and in the dream it was like everybody disappeared. You know, it was a kind of a weird, that uneasiness that comes from horror, and so came up with this story based on that, kind of weaving a couple of things that I thought were interesting, and it ended up kind of being like Aliens meets Lovecraft, which I thought was pretty fun, and we'll see if people like it. So take a look at it if you want to, and if horror's not your thing, that's okay too. You know, not everyone likes everything. Robert E. Howard anniversary, thoughts on his legacy. One of my favorite pulp writers. I love Robert E. Howard's writing. He definitely decided to end his life way too early. He could have done so much more, but you know, that's what it is. What happened when I was a 3-year-old? Almost axiomatic as a father of twin 3-year-olds. Yeah, it's just like all the settings changed. So like one time I went to turn on my amp, and my son's like, play guitar, and he turns on the amp, and it's like so loud he like screams, right? And it's because he came over and just started turning all the knobs. And if you can see my amp back there, there's a lot of knobs. You know, there's like 20 knobs on that thing. So all my settings that I'd had, this is the other thing too, I was like, I've had the same settings on those channels for literally 10 years. And so all those settings are gone. You know, I have to, and it's when you're working with analog amps, it's like you kind of want to mark where it's like right here, where this pot is right here, that's the sound. And that's kind of what you have to go with. Kaku gives me $2 for K. All right. Thank you. Excuse me. Another Darth Kilhoun. Why are authoritarian governments written bad guy most of the time? Why are authoritarian governments written bad guy most time? I don't know. I think they are the bad guy usually. How's your reading of Twilight going? I finished the first book. I'm reading the second book. Let me see if I missed some other stuff. Okay. Why do so many people lose creative inspiration after achieving success? So I was reading a R.A. Salvatore. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. One of the Drizzt books. And there was a thing with this dwarf. It's like once the dwarf achieves his like perfect vision, you can fall into massive despair and be unable to create. And it's because you can't replicate the feelings, and you can't replicate all the things that went into the success of whatever made you successful. So why do so many people lose creative inspiration after achieving success? Well, the main thing is that the inspiration comes when you don't have success, whereas afterwards there's less possibilities. There's only one way to go, and that's down. So you can be much more worried about the quality of your work after you're successful. And that's something that I think happens to some people. And also, a lot of times you're driven by hunger. If you're not successful, you're really driven to try to achieve success. So it makes sense that after you achieve it, you lose some of that drive, which helped you achieve success in the first place. The other thing is, really hyper success always has a factor of randomness to it. This is something that I've discovered, and I'm pretty sure on that this is just a theory about art. Art success is randomness is a big part of it, meaning, there's a bunch of people and they're all putting out interesting new books, but one of them is the one that becomes hyper successful. Like, why was it Harry Potter? Obviously, if people knew that the Harry Potter formula was going to be mega successful, they would have all been doing it at the same time or before J.K. Rowling. They didn't know that. Nobody knew what was going to be the next hyper success. It's just a bunch of different variations, and one of them happens to be what really piques people's interest. So there's always an element of randomness, and so it's really hard to replicate that randomness. It's like hitting the lottery twice. So it's really hard to hit the lottery twice. Now, this is for people who achieve that explosive mega success. If you are more like a slow burn kind of, if you're like Motorhead, Motorhead, their success was earned through intensive hard work over decades, not some explosive success. So there's less ways to go downhill. You can keep doing what you want to do, and it's going to be okay. You're not backsliding. It's like, oh, I went from playing arenas to playing clubs. That sucks. But if you never went to the arenas, it's not a big deal. Sorry, mistake. When it comes to the three, do you think there's a distrust, disrespect, and paranoia and conflicting attitudes between being cynical and skeptical? So yes, I've talked about cynical versus skeptical. So skeptical means, I don't believe something until it's proven to me. Cynical says there's no value in whatever somebody's trying to do. So a skeptical person might say, I'm skeptical that the MMR vaccine is as safe as 3 separate vaccines. The cynical person would be like, the MMR vaccine is there to poison you, right? It's there to hurt you. So cynical people are like, it's all just money. It's only there to make money. So cynical people tend to not operate on some level of like, I'm waiting to be convinced. They simply are, I'm out, I'm done. I'm not receiving information. So one can lead to the other. Let me see if I missed anything else. Okay, okay. Before I read a whole bunch more stuff, let me talk about the Writestream topic today, which is three different archetypes for characters that you see a lot in fantasy and horror. And one of the reasons you see them in fantasy and horror is fantasy and horror contain fantastical elements. And those three are the Unbeliever, the True Believer, and the Conspiracy Theorist. So the Unbeliever is a character that is presented with something paranormal, something fantastical, something that is outside of the realm of normal expectations. And his response to that is to simply not believe it. This is not a skeptical thing. This is not a cynical thing. It's just he doesn't believe it. And so because he doesn't believe it, that has consequences for him. In horror, the Unbeliever is usually a person who ends up becoming a victim due to his unbelief. So when the zombies are rising from the grave, the person says, there's no such thing as... So if you come in and say, there's zombies outside, the Unbeliever says, there's no such thing as zombies. Notice that the reaction is not like, what? It's just, you must be crazy because there's no such thing as zombies. And so because they don't believe in zombies, they're like, look, I'll go outside and I'll check. And they open the door and a zombie eats them. So the consequence of unbelief is usually death in horror. Or the decision is, once you are confronted with the evidence of your senses, do you either cross the threshold and become a believer, or do you refuse the evidence of your senses and become a victim? And that's usually what happens. So in horror, you usually use the Unbeliever as sort of zombie fodder. A good example, and I actually have done some content on this that'll come out at some point, another H.P. Lovecraft story called The Color Out of Space. The primary victim in it is an unbeliever. It's this farmer Nahum, and this asteroid crashes in his yard and begins all of these horrible changes in his farm and starts causing his family to go insane. And he doesn't believe that there's something paranormal happening. He doesn't believe the evidence of his senses. He believes it only to the point that he has to, which is the cabbages have weird colors. He doesn't believe that the trees are swaying without wind. He doesn't send his wife to a mental hospital when she goes insane. He locks her in the attic because he doesn't believe that the poison well water can actually be affecting him. So that's the unbeliever, and he usually has significant consequences for that. Now, in fantasy, the unbeliever has another purpose, which is to resist the fantastical or the fairy, right? The realm of that which is supernatural. He's resisting it and doesn't want to enter it. So the unbeliever is somebody who doesn't believe in witchcraft or wants to burn witches in a fantasy novel, for example. If you read something like by Stephen R. Donaldson, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, he is the archetypical unbeliever. Is that he is sucked away to this fantasy realm called the land, where he's healed of his leprosy, and he refuses to believe in its reality. And he refuses to believe in his reality because of a bit of circular reasoning, and that's usually one of the things that unbelievers have. This must be a dream, even though my senses are telling me that it's real. It must be a dream because my leprosy is cured and nerves don't regenerate. That's where it comes from. And he even tests this to the point where he rapes a girl, and it's a very off-putting scene at the beginning of the first Thomas Covenant book. It has major repercussions throughout the story as well. But he refuses to believe it, and that guides all of his choices all the way through the book. Now, one of the things about his journey as an unbeliever is that the dream represents everything he wants, if he believes it's a dream. So the land is a representation of everything that he actually wants in his real life, which is healing from his leprosy. But his leprosy has also made him a social outcast. So it gives him social acceptance. People immediately accept and care for him in the land. So it heals him physically, and it gives him social acceptance, and it also gives him potency in two forms. The first one is sexual potency, because one of the problems with his leprosy is he's impotent, and the first chapters of the book goes through this where he sees these 16-year-old girls and he lusts after them, right? He sees that they're attractive and is frustrated that he's impotent. Well, he goes to the land and meets a 16-year-old girl and isn't impotent, and then doesn't believe the dream and rapes her. So it's very it's a very off-putting scene, but it's kind of important when you understand that the hell that Thomas Covenant is going through because of his unbelief is the land which promises him everything. He's potent also in that he is the most important person in the story. He has a wedding ring. I'm not wearing my wedding ring right now, but it's a white gold wedding ring, and has some magical powers that everybody expects him to use to overcome this Dark Lord Fowl. So it gives him everything he wants, but it's hell to him because it's not real, because he refuses to believe in it. And it reminds me of the scene in the last battle of C.S. Lewis's Narnia trilogy, series, it's 7 books, where after the world ends and everybody's passed through the door to the next life with Aslan, the dwarves are sitting on the ground still believing they're inside the barn. They're refusing to believe the evidence of their senses. They are the unbeliever. So for them, Narnia is not fantastical fairy, but the next life is. So of course it's a metaphor for people who refuse to believe, refuse to have faith despite the evidence of their senses telling them that God is real, that the afterlife is real, that all these things are real. So they have a vision on the road to Damascus and still don't believe. And that's kind of what they represent. So the unbeliever is a very, very cool archetypical character. In horror, it's usually a person who is there to represent the unbeliever, the skeptic, and then become zombie fodder because he refuses to believe. Now we contrast that with the true believer. So the thing about these different archetypes is that they're often presented next to each other or in contrast to each other as they're butting heads. So if you imagine, a horror movie, like it could be anything. There's a best friend who doesn't believe that the ghosts are real or the vampires are real. And then there's the main character who's a true believer. So the true believer sees the evidence of his senses and immediately believes it. So you would say, well, that sounds rather boring. Well, it is, but you can do lots of creative things with it, which is the true believer who believes immediately is usually deceived in the third act. So in the third act, he finds out that that which he believed to be real is not really real. So he believes in vampires. He's been told that there's vampires, and then he gets to the third act, and it turns out they're not vampires. It was like a trick, right? So this is something that the true believer has. But the unbeliever a lot of times just exists for the true believer to actually be able to have some potency. Like, no, the vampires are real. We're going to take action to survive. So the true believer takes action to survive in the horror movie. In the fantasy setting, the true believer acts very quickly in order to be potent in whatever the element of fairy that's imposing upon the real world is. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, you have this in the first book. You have the older children are unbelievers, specifically the older sister, whose name escapes me. But you have the little girl Lucy who goes to Narnia and comes back and says, I went to this place, Narnia, and it's a really amazing, fantastical place. And they're like, we don't believe you, because we don't believe you. And so the uncle gives a basic one, which is like, you think Lucy is insane or lying? And they're like, what? It's like, those are the only two options. Either she's insane or she's lying. Do you think she's lying? I guess, and then they're like, I don't know. I don't want to confront that. But it's a basic theological argument, which is like, are they insane or lying? So the unbelievers are there to test the true believer, which is Lucy. Lucy's the true believer in that she immediately embraces the reality of Narnia and fully embraces all of the lessons that are in it. When we get to the final book, you find that the older sister isn't part of the group that dies in the train crash and goes into the afterlife, because she has become an unbeliever. She's gone back to being an unbeliever. She no longer believes in Narnia. She doesn't believe in the evidence of her senses, whereas her older brothers, George and Edward, and all of the older children besides her actually do. So it's a very interesting way that C.S. Lewis presents these two archetypical characters kind of contrasting one another. Last archetype or archetype is the conspiracy theorist. Now, the conspiracy theorist is almost always an auxiliary character and very rarely is the main character. But the conspiracy theorist doesn't just believe the evidence of his senses. He believes beyond the evidence of his senses. So the conspiracy theorist is assembling lots of different pieces of evidence to believe in something fantastical or, slightly unbelievable. The conspiracy theorist usually exists in a horror setting to tell the protagonist of the actual threat. So early in the book, you'll have someone that's like, there's vampires out in the woods, and they're like, you're a crazy old man. In 12 Monkeys, you had, when Bruce Willis goes back, he meets a bum who's ripped his teeth out, and he's like, they track you through your teeth. And so the immediate thing is to not believe the conspiracy theorist. You're crazy. You're a crazy old man who ripped his teeth out because you're mentally ill. Then you get to the third act, and you realize the conspiracy theorist was real, and Bruce Willis rips his teeth out so they can't take him back to the future. So the conspiracy theorist is almost always proven to be correct. And indeed, when the conspiracy theorist is the main character, usually he's correct. I'm thinking of the movie Conspiracy Theory, starring Mel Gibson, where all of his crazy beliefs, you think he's mentally ill the whole time, and then he's actually getting abducted by, like, Patrick Stewart's character, and what comes out of that is that he has some sort of mind that's able to actually perceive beyond what normal people are able to assemble, and the conspiracy theories, all of them are real. So his struggle is against, the unbeliever as well. He's, in a way, he's a more extreme version of the true believer. But the true believer simply believes the evidence of the senses, whereas the conspiracy theorist believes beyond that. So conspiracy theorists are usually the people who kind of create the inception of ideas in a horror or a fantasy story. They're the people that tell you what's real before your main characters are willing to accept what's real. You could think of, these character archetypes, they kind of brush along if you watch The Matrix, You have, obviously, you have Neo, who really, he's an unbeliever. But when you have the red pill, blue pill, this is his character growth. The unbeliever either has to not believe and be destroyed, or believe the evidence of his senses and go beyond what he's normally accepting of as reality, and then have growth from that. So he's presented with the red pill, blue pill. He takes the red pill, meaning he's accepting some evidence of his senses that there's something beyond this. Then he wakes up and he sees that that the world essentially is completely different from how he thought. Let me get to some super chats here. From Kaku, death, mind, body, or spirit is the final result. But do you think all three archetypes can be afflicted with madness or insanity over said threats? Yes, before death. Totally. But I would say the madnesses are slightly different, right? So, as part of the descent into madness, somebody who's an unbeliever, like I talked about this in the other video, in the Nameless City, the guy who's going down, he's kind of an unbeliever. He doesn't believe quite what he's seeing. He doesn't believe that the city was actually made by the reptiles until the very end. So the madness that comes from that is that if he's forced to accept something which he doesn't believe is real, he can have like a psychic crisis and go insane. Or other people can view him as insane, even though he has to step across that threshold. Likewise, the true believer can encounter madness when it turns out he's wrong. That's where I would see the true believer is actually encountering his madness, is when it turns out he's wrong. The conspiracy theorist is usually viewed as already insane, and he would really only become more insane if he was forced to face up to the reality that his conspiracy theories were bunk. This is a thing that I think... I'm going to turn down the fan for a second. It's blowing hair in my eyes and irritating me. This is a thing that I see in the real world. Out in the real world. So you have this thing called Russia. You have this conspiracy theory that somehow Russia interfered with U.S. elections, or Donald Trump, the president of the United States, is a puppet working for Putin. Now, years go by and finally it comes out. Like, there's no evidence. You have to come to, there's a fork in the road. You either have to decide what I believed is wrong, or I refuse to stop believing my conspiracy theories. And so a lot of people, in fact, most people in the media, they're still talking about like some sort of Russian conspiracy. It's like you are insane at this point. You meet the qualifications of madness, which is you do not accept the evidence of your senses, and are in fact in rebellion of the evidence of your senses. And the evidence of your senses are in conflict with everybody else's. That's madness. So I see that in the real world. And I think you could actually make a character that'd be very compelling that's like that. It's that conspiracy theory becomes, it doesn't come to fulfillment. So what's the result? What do you do? Are talking about when Bruner created Aegis Fang in the Crystal Shard? Yes, I am. From Nitaku. Yes, that's true. That's the fourth book. That's the one I'm reading now. I read the first three when they were called like a trilogy. So now, I guess there's 12 books. So we'll read all 12, and I'll give you guys some analysis of them. They're very good books. The first book in particular does some really great exposition, and it uses a couple of little tricks that most people aren't aware of, where it just tells you things, because it's way more efficient than trying to show them passively or indirectly. All right, let's look at some chat. I think I missed some stuff. Miss anything? Okay, let's go back down. Since you're not a big fan of TV, what are your thoughts on the TV movie? Neat idea or terrible creation? I think it's a neat idea. Netflix has continued that with some movies of dubious quality, but I think it's a great idea. The Hobbit cartoon was a TV movie. It gives you an opportunity to make movies with a different business model in mind, a different kind of budget, different focus. TV movies are great. They're a limited viewing experience, which is the main thing. So you have to You look at it, it's like you can't pull out any kind of soap opera tricks, but you can still leave people at a cliffhanger for the commercial breaks, Make laser discs great again. That's the other thing, right? If you have a physical Blu-ray, as long as you have a Blu-ray player, you can watch that movie in the future. Your subscription service may not exist in the future. Who knows? In your last Writestream, you said that To Kill a Mockingbird paints an inaccurate picture of the South. Could you elaborate on that? It would take me a long time. But basically, let me give you the summation. White people are not as racist as they're portrayed, and black communities are not as nice as they're portrayed. Right? One of the reasons that black communities have lots of difficulties in the South is they do have problems with crime. They do have problems with just the same thing with like inner city stuff. Right? It's not racist to say, well, the black neighborhoods are dangerous and they have major drug issues, they have violence issues. That stuff exists. It's there. So what happens though is that because you're afraid of offending people, or you really want to paint a picture that's about like white people having, an incorrect prejudice towards black people, you create something like To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, in defense of it, it's a very well-crafted book. In defense of it, the thing is that what's missing from it is really any kind of the accurate portrayal of the social problems in the black community. So the social problems in the black community are mostly missing. And in fact, I think there's very few scenes of the black community, and one of them is like, they're at a church and collecting money, for this guy who's been accused of rape. And of course, he's innocent, and the white jury convicts him anyway. Well, I mean, would that happen in the South? The answer is yes, it totally would. But it wouldn't happen. I mean, the prejudice would be real, but the prejudice would also be based on some real problems in the black community. So it would be almost understandable for somebody who lives next to that to first assume, to lean more towards guilt, I should say. But that doesn't mean that white juries are automatically going to convict black assailants in spite of overwhelming evidence that they're innocent. That I don't think is accurate either. Now, I say that being born in the Deep South, I'm from East Texas originally. There is racism, but it's probably gotten better than it used to be. A lot of things like people forget about Jim Crow. Jim Crow was not imposed. Jim Crow was imposed by the government. It wasn't necessarily something everybody wanted, whether you were white or black. So the people who are generally a little bit more judging the individual, they just don't get represented as much. Have you decided to have weekly metal album reviews? I will. I'll probably have one this week. So for Ralph, what do you want to hear first? You want to hear Dark Throne or Majestica? So those are, and I also listen to the new, there's a bunch of new records I've listened to. I'm going to have reviews of all of them, but I'm going to try to limit myself to one per week so I don't get overwhelmed talking about metal albums, and also to help me focus. And I tend to focus on the good ones. And the new Dark Throne one's pretty good. The new Majestica album is awesome. So I do recommend you check out the new Majestica album if you haven't. It's called Above the Sky. And Tommy Johansson is an excellent vocalist and guitarist. It's great. I like it much better than Sabaton, who he also plays for, I guess. And I like it better than his previous stuff with Rainseed. Nitaku says, I actually have trouble writing the beginning of my books. I write them kind of backwards. That's fine. I tend to write mine forwards. Some people write them out of order. And if you're good at planning, you can write the scenes out of order and assemble them later and kind of write the connecting material later. A lot of screenwriters write stuff out of order because it just helps you to focus on the most important scenes. If you write all the most important scenes first, you don't spend a lot of time writing filler that you have to cut later. It really helps you dial in and figure out exactly what you need to write. So it's totally okay to write the end before the beginning. I always have the end in mind, but I tend to write things linearly. It's the workflow that works for me. Having written a bunch of books now, it's just what works. And you don't have to do what works. You can do what works for you if it's different. And you can try out what works for me, and if it doesn't work, okay. If I give suggestions, other people do this and it works for them. Even if I don't use it, other people still do and still find value with it, and maybe it'll work for you. Likewise, if I say, you can try just writing the dialogue before you write the prose. If you're feeling kind of, man, I'm just not good at writing prose, or I don't know how to write this paragraph or I describe this action, start with the dialogue, and that'll help you inform exactly how you want to write the action. A lot of times, most of my revision happens to go in two ways. Is the dialogue natural? Does it sound right? And then, is this prose accurately describing what I want it to describe? And does it sound the way I want it to sound? Does it have the right amount of hoop-de-doodle, or is it too much hoop-de-doodle? Or am I missing some hoop-de-doodle? A hoop-de-doodle is like, florid prose. Things like that. Archiver, what's your opinion on stories that are written so vaguely that they are open to multiple widely varying interpretations? Clever or just pretentious? Totally depends on the execution. Depends on the execution. So, did Neo ever actually leave the Matrix? I don't think he did. But if you had pointed that out, then that would kind of go against the entire point of the red pill, blue pill thing, which is the red pill stepping over a threshold. So it's like, are you gonna see this for what it really is, or do we have to spell it out? If they spelled it out, it wouldn't have been as effective. And by the way, as time goes on, I think that third Matrix movie is way better than when I first saw it, and I think the second one's way worse. Also, Marty, don't turn on the amplifier. There's a slight chance of overload. I should do it as like Morty. Rick and Morty was originally going to be the guys from Back to the Future. That's what I heard. Is Mace Windu a good example of a true believer, considering his first words in episode 1, a Sith Lord? I do not believe they could have returned without us knowing. I don't know. So, Mace Windu is a very interesting character. Mace Windu he's very sensitive to being blinded by the Force. And so that's the first thing. Could they have returned without us knowing? And at the end of episode 2, it's like, we need to inform the Senate that we're blind to the changes of the Force. We don't know what's happening right now, and it's very upsetting for him. I don't know if he's a true believer. I don't know if he fits into that. I think he's an interesting character, though. I'll have to think about him. I actually like Mace Windu, and I like Samuel L. Jackson as Mace Windu. His delivery kind of works for this slightly detached kind of Master Jedi. Daniel Hoffman says, very nice show you have here. Thank you. What do you think of the theory that were one or more highly advanced ancient human civilizations that became lost to history? I mean, I'll believe it when there's evidence of it, but I don't see any evidence of highly advanced ancient human civilization. So, and there's a couple things, like if we use let's use our culture to say we're highly advanced. What do we have that would persist and last through time? Well, first of all, the iron would be lost. So there's something that's going for the theory. Iron rusts away to nothing over time. So finding Iron Age weapons is super rare from early Iron Age. Bronze Age weapons are plentiful because you can stick a piece of bronze in the soil. It comes out green. You can polish off the scale and it shines like somebody made it. Like somebody just made it, but it was made in 300 BC or even earlier. So Iron Age weapons tend to rust away to nothing due to the nature of iron, and this is true for steel. So what would last all this time? Would stainless steel last? Well, I mean, stainless steel would definitely persist longer. So if a previous civilization had access to high quality alloys, likely those would stick around. Titanium, certain kinds of high quality stainless steel, chrome things would stick around. They'd stick around through the dirt. Likewise, what do we build our buildings out of? Well, my house is made of wood, so that wouldn't stand the test of time. The roof is tile, so pot shards would stand the test of time. They would stick around. But the concrete is what would actually stick around, the concrete. So the concrete is like man-made stone. You crush up the limestone, you mix it with the substrate, you make rock. We make rock. How cool is that? So the concrete would probably stick around. So if you're not seeing the stuff that would stick around from a civilization similar to ours, then that's what you wait for evidence. So I don't believe that there's highly advanced human civilizations that were lost to history. I do think that past civilizations were more advanced than they are often given credit for. Particularly the Hellenistic cultures, the Roman cultures. We don't know what Carthage was like, but it was probably fairly advanced, probably on the same level as Rome. Rome had, water toilets, sewers. They knew how to make concrete. So Roman concrete sticks around. Whoa. If the Romans knew how to make concrete, chances are a previous ancient civilization also knew how to make concrete. So, those things that stick around. Rome had extensive libraries. It's not until we find that due to the way that the civilization collapsed through sacking and things like that, a lot of libraries were lost. You look at something like the libraries near Mount Vesuvius, like in Herculaneum, that we're still, we're trying to slowly unravel these burnt scrolls to figure out what's on them. And in fact, the Vatican has like scientists dedicated to do this, just to try to figure out what's written on these ancient scrolls. We've recovered books that we thought were lost to time. How cool is that? So people were probably better read than we realize. Likewise, the so-called Dark Ages were not nearly as dark as people like to believe. It's like, oh, well, you had all these, you had these illiterate Franks. It's like, well, the Franks were never literate. So saying that there's a decline when a people that was never literate remains illiterate or only gains a certain amount of literacy is not quite accurate. So the Dark Ages were not as dark as people believe. But things tend to get lost over time because we don't think about preserving them, right? Even me, I don't think about preserving the books I've read. I give them away. And what happens to them? We don't make books that last. They're made out of crappy pulp paper. Whereas Bibles from the medieval period stick around because they're made on like silk ragweed paper or silk rag paper that's really endures. Likewise, a lot of the art from the Asian cultures in the Middle Ages has really stuck around because they used really high quality inks, whereas lots of art that was probably more common then is lost because it's made in crappy paper that rots away to nothing. Likewise, we don't know what music people listened to in the Renaissance. We really don't. We have barely an idea because almost no secular music is recorded. Only the sacred music was written down because of the nature of the mass and wanting to distribute music. The music of the folk wasn't written down, so we don't really know what it sounded like. We have some vague ideas based on some English secular music that was written down and some other secular music that was written here and there. A lot of stuff gets lost to history, more than we'd like to believe. Do you think Luke became a true believer by the end of the Star Wars trilogy due to everything he went through and becoming more of the Force? So Luke was always the true believer. Excuse me. Sorry, a little tickle there. Luke was always the true believer. He was ready to go on an adventure with Obi-Wan right away. Sorry, I've got some itchy eyes today or something, hair in my eye. Luke was always the true believer. He believed in the Force right away. And as soon as Obi-Wan demonstrated it, like with his mind trick, it's like, the Force is real. I want to study this. I want to be a Jedi. And that's been his character arc all the way through. All the way to the point where he has a sort of a crisis of faith when he finds out Darth Vader is his father. But still can persist through that. The unbeliever would probably be Han Solo. But he's really, he has elements of an unbeliever. He doesn't want to believe the evidence of his senses, but by the end of it, he overcomes that, right? So he's kind of a skeptical guy. I wouldn't call him an unbeliever necessarily, but if you're going to put them in those categories, Luke is a true believer, whereas, Han would be the unbeliever to kind of contrast off of him. I've never seen one all-powerful force, that kind of thing. Cynicism is rather one that is chronically ill-disposed to think that other humans have altruistic values. So that it's an assumption of bad faith in cynicism. I wouldn't mind going digital if it meant getting actual MP3 and Mobi files when I buy books and music albums. Companies seem to only want to provide streaming options instead. Yeah, because the streaming options get you to keep paying even though you maybe don't want anything new. That's why they do like it. Likewise, record companies, instead of paying royalties to their artists, accepted equities in the streaming companies. I found that out from Billy Corgan stream with Joe Rogan. I didn't know that. Now, one thing I do like about Winter Sun. So the last Winter Sun, if you bought the digital files from them, they were like high quality FLAC files. They included all kinds of other cool stuff that most people don't think about with digital. Just like the instrumental tracks, isolated instrumental tracks. Make your own mixes. karaoke versions of the song, so you can create a different version of the song if you want. Just a bunch of different extras that should be part of the digital landscape, but aren't, because we're kind of locked into a 20th century mentality of music production. Let's see here. Are you talking about when? Yes, Bruner, I already answered that. Let's see here. Oh, missed something. Sorry. YouTube chat just jumps around whenever somebody it's annoying. Nitaku says, in a book I'm writing, there's power in disbelief, and in that it can protect one from the supernatural. However, once you accept the true world, you lose that protection forever. Now that's interesting. So, if you've ever played the game Final Fantasy Tactics, one of my very favorite games of all time. It's so favorite, in fact, that I'm pulling out my PlayStation Vita, and there it is right there, guys. There's my... I'm looking at a floating eye I captured, right? There it is. So what's great about the Vita is you can play Tactics Ogre and you can play Final Fantasy Tactics. So they have this system where you have faith and bravery. And so bravery would increase your physical attacks and stuff. Faith increases your magic attacks, but also increases your susceptibility to magic. So it's a twofold thing. You get healed better if you have high faith, and you do more damage as a mage, but you also take more damage. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. And so if you have low faith, well, you don't take a lot of magic damage, which means that mages aren't as much of a threat. However, you also don't take a lot of healing from your white mages. So there's a double-edged sword to all of it that I really, really love. Now, this has elements in my fantasy story. Your ability to use magic is your ability to conceive of the pure concept of what you're trying to do magic-wise for most mages. So it's kind of faith. It's kind of faith-based. I did have another fairy tale, which I never released, but maybe I'll put it out one of these days for you guys. Basically, a wizard teaching a boy magic, and the magic is entirely based on your belief in magic. So the belief in the magic creates the magic, and the disbelief in the magic causes you to not be able to control the magic. It's a very interesting idea. But yeah, I like that idea too. Let's see here. My only impression of the Narnia series was that it gave me an inflated expectation of how good Turkish Delight was. When I tried it when I got older, I was sorely disappointed. Yeah, he went through a whole lot of trouble for that Turkish Delight. Jay Dyer has theorized that Hollywood is run by feds and many subsects of mafias. It's totally possible. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of mafia stuff I might believe too, I know that Nevada's heavily done with mafia because the casinos give you an opportunity to launder money infinitely. Any cash business, that's how you launder money, guys. So let's say you have an illegal income like with racketeering. In order to use that money, a lot of times you have to legitimize it. And that's where money laundering comes in. They call it laundering because you usually do it with a laundromat or an arcade. So arcades aren't so popular anymore, but laundromats are. The coin-op laundromat, you just deposit the cash you got from your illegal business as if people had spent that money at your legal business, the high cash business, and boom, you get your money laundered. That's how money laundering works. So that's why the mafia is all over Nevada, is because it's an infinite money laundering business. You can deposit as much cash as you want. Do you believe any conspiracy theories? I don't know. If I believe them, then I don't really think they're conspiracy theories. Denizen of the Depths. I read Voices of the Void today. Quite a good work. Nice job on it. The word is very interesting and compelling. Any inspiration behind it you can share? Yes. Thanks for asking that. So first of all, H.P. Lovecraft and the idea of the Cthulhu mythos. That's the first one. But also, actually, there was a game that I played back in the 90s called Marathon. And the third game had an eldritch horror, a Lovecraftian old god trapped within a sun that got loosed when they, used some weapon to make the sun go nova. All this you read about, you don't see it because of the nature of the game engine, the primitive game engine. But I thought about that, I was like, and then also the Balrog of Moria is a big inspiration of that, which is that at some point, there was like an ancient war, a war between demons and angels. And the demons obviously lost, or we'd be imprisoned by them to a greater degree anyway. So the power, the demonic power is not just the power of, in fact, it's not the power of force, right? It's not a physical power. The demonic power is one that is over the mind. You notice in the Bible, people who are possessed by demons are insane. And you cast out the demons and they regain their mind. So demons have power over your mind. And so that's where the Wurtla comes from. So the Wurtla, through his whispers, calls you down. And the Call of Cthulhu. What's the Call of Cthulhu about? Cthulhu is calling you down. He's calling you to his grave. It's very interesting. So all that stuff is inspiration. And then I kind of did it my own way. And there's a little bit of behind-the-scenes world building. If I do a follow-up to that book, then you'll get to explore more of that. Spielberg's first movie, Duel, was a TV movie. Let's see here. Yeah, the Scottsboro trial is a perfect example of why we need evidence of rape and shouldn't just believe. Yeah, totally. What are some books you would recommend that do descent into madness really well? Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad actually predates Lovecraft and does it really well. And the iterations of it. It is probably my least favorite Stephen King book, but it does include that. I'd probably say The Shining is a better example of descent into madness. Although you don't have a physical descent into madness, you have this slow, step-by-step, incremental loss of the normal and embracing of the extreme. And that's kind of how that one works, and I think it's actually very, very good. If you ever make, let's see here. So that's a good one. Actually, that is a good Stephen King one. Also, Insomnia is a good one that does descent into madness. Let me think if there's another one. Tommyknockers, I don't remember if that's a novella or I think that's a novella. Tommyknockers, which is basically the color out of space, but with aliens. Anything by Lovecraft. I'm trying to think of some other stuff. It's hard to think of everything off the top of my head. To stop and go look at the bookshelf or something. If you ever want to make an audiobook for Voices of the Void, I highly suggest hiring AJ to voice the protagonist. His screams fit perfectly with the character's increasing madness. I'm glad you liked it. Let's see here. Former White House guard who befriended my parents in the 80s says it was an open secret that LBJ had JFK killed. He also said LBJ met Oswald's mother in a locked room. So that is one that I don't know if I believe it, but I could believe it. Lyndon Baines Johnson stole millions of dollars from my family using basically a bribed judge. And I don't want to get too deep into it. It's all ancient history, and I'd have to go look up all the details of the case. But he actually personally stole millions of dollars from my great-grandfather. So he's someone that I consider unrepentantly evil. He also had dead people voting for him from the grave. Truly, I think LBJ was an incredibly evil man, far more evil than he's recognized to be. Since then. Ever considered Texas as an anagram of taxes? I mean, God, no taxes. From Kaku, I missed the super chat. Sorry. Keep, Return, Burn, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or Twilight. Keep, Return, Burn, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or Twilight. I'd keep all of them. Twilight's not written for me. I'd still keep it. Let's see here. Action Brick. I feel like writing your ending first is like eating dessert before dinner. Well, maybe writing it first. I could see that. Certainly reading the ending first is like that. But it's good to know where you're going. It's good to know where you're going with the story, at least. Different people like to do different amounts of planning. But I think if you know the ending before the beginning, it's very helpful. You ought to know the ending before you begin. I loved the first Back to the Future, didn't care for the second, and enjoyed the third. I liked the third more than most people. I like the second my favorite. Second might be my favorite, though. It's the wackiest. I love conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories, I think, are super fun. I think they're super fun to talk about. And I think the JFK one is like the most believable one. I like the idea of ancient aliens, actually, even though I don't believe it at all, because I love Stargate. Stargate was like one of my very favorite movies, believe it or not, for a long time. And I need to go back and watch it and do an analysis of it, because it nails all this stuff, right? So in Stargate, you have the true believer. You have, I think his name's Daniel, right? He's the Egyptologist. He believes that the aliens, or he's really a conspiracy theorist, let's be honest. He believes that aliens built the pyramids, and no one believes him. Everyone thinks he's completely out of his mind. And you contrast that with what's his name? Kurt Russell's character, who's a non-believer. He's an unbeliever. I don't believe it till I see it. And then when he's confronted with the evidence of his senses, he's like, I have to walk over that threshold and believe it. It's real. And so it's a that happens like in the first act, but it's great. I love Stargate. I don't believe most, but I love them. Great stories. I do too. Yeah, I love to read the stories of different conspiracy theories. I like Masonic conspiracy theories. I think those are fun. Catholics really like Masonic conspiracy theories, I notice. And so I get along with that. You should read a book called Lucifer Dethroned by Bill Schnoebelen. It's a conspiracy book, but the guy who wrote it claims it's true. And it's such a compelling and creepy book. Same thing with theosophical books that actually inspired a lot of Lovecraft stuff. Is they believe they're real and they're like conspiracy theory stuff. I like the conspiracy theories surrounding the Vatican right now. And then I might be inclined to actually believe them. And maybe I'm letting out a little too much. But there's some conspiracy theories about what do they call it? The Mauve Mafia or the Velvet Mafia? I'm trying to remember what they call it. People are called the Purple Mafia. Basically the gay mafia within the Catholic Church that forced the Pope to resign and got elected a Jesuit. And I love Jesuit conspiracies, by the way, too, guys. I think they're fun. I don't think the Jesuits are like an evil order. But, a Jesuit Pope. A Jesuit Pope who probably covered up for a lot of Catholic sexual abuse. May have participated in it. How did this happen? Well, there's lots of conspiracies surrounding that. And I think they're all very interesting, put it that way. If I talk too much about conspiracy theories, it gets your channel demonetized, depending on how you do it. So you got to watch out. If you're doing it really seriously, if you're like, this is true, it's like, they're already saying that if you're doing flat earth videos, we're just going to show a bunch of mainstream media stuff on the site. So you can't do flat earth videos anymore. In fact, I actually think, I don't believe the earth is flat at all, but I think the idea of a flat earth conspiracy might be kind of like a fun story. In fact, I might write a story, a conspiracy theory story I might write next that involves flat earth. It's called Flat Earth. And basically the flat earth conspiracy is a conspiracy. And that's the logline. Hardwick, are you interested in writing hard science fiction? I have already written hard science fiction. So yes. It is not popular, though. I'll just let you know. Hard science fiction, there's a market for it, but the market's small. It's all about space opera now for some reason. For whatever reason, the old style science fiction from the 60s and 70s, it's just not popular right now, and it just doesn't really seem to stick. There is a market for it, but most people are going straight over to military sci-fi or straight up space opera stuff like Star Wars. And in fact, there's going to be a vacuum for it as Disney continues to run the greatest franchise in the history of the world into the ground. Yeah, Luke was a true believer until The Last Jedi. Then they made him a quitting loser. Totally. Yeah, it was awful. If there was a novel about the rise of Islam and it was written from Muhammad's point of view, would it be more interesting to make him a true believer or unbeliever? I think it'd be more interesting to make him an unbeliever. And this is a biblical thing, right? So you have the story of Jonah. Jonah's an unbeliever. He refuses to do God's will, and he ends up being swallowed by fish till he can't refuse God's will anymore, and he has to do it. So you have lots of stories like that where someone refuses God's call. Eventually, the Apostle Paul is refusing the message. He's stoning Christians, and he has a conversion on the road to Damascus. He's blinded and is forcibly converted, which is a big reason why people believe in unconditional election, right? No, you will do this. He's an unbeliever, and he suffers for it because of his unbelief. So these archetypes have very, very deep roots and biblical roots. In fact, maybe we're all inspired by some of these biblical stories in this case, like Apostle Paul, Job, especially Job, who is a true believer. But even though he's afflicted by all these horrible maladies, he never loses his faith. Versus Jonah, who gets eaten by the whale. Let's see here. Do you ever feel bad when you make too many characters in a story and you basically have to Thanos snap them from existence? Kind of feels like I'm performing an abortion. Yeah, I don't, but there's a lesson there, which is you only have room. Anytime you add a character, you have to do something with that character. That character has to exist for some reason. He needs a couple lines of dialogue so people know who he is. Even if it's just like, so there's characters that's like protagonist, antagonist, best friend. Then there's like the gang, the supporting cast. So if you look at Aliens, it's like there's Ripley and there's that corporate guy that, I'm trying to remember his character name. Paul Reiser. It was Paul Reiser's character. Hicks, the android, Bishop, the girl, and then there's just, there's everybody else, right? And yeah, they all have a little bit of personality, and James Cameron takes the time to show you a little bit who they are. You have the two female members. One's a pilot. The other one is like basically almost trans. She's doing pull-ups. She's super, she's a really strong woman. They do a couple scenes like that. And they even make fun of it, So you see the characters constantly making fun of each other. Hudson and all these people making fun of each other. So you get this perception of the gang. But each time you introduce a character, you have to have some sort of characterization, otherwise they're a waste. And you have to Thanos snap them. You have to cut them out. So depending on how long your book is, obviously you only have so much room for what kind of characters you're going to put in it. So you have to think about that ahead of time. And I generally just think of the big main actors, and then supporting actors I add kind of as I go. $200 of, I don't know what DKK stands for. So thanks. I assume it's a lot of money that I'm gonna be paying off some debts. I actually don't have a lot of debts, but thank you from Negelsacks. Hereby a meager appreciation of your retro gaming cred and stuff, like giving your work away for free. I mean, dude, David, I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot. I don't know what DKK stands for. I'm gonna Google it. What is DKK? Danish krones. I didn't know Danish krones were still a thing. I thought Denmark was on the euro. Oh my God, I feel so embarrassed. I feel embarrassed that I didn't know that. I was like, oh yeah, Denmark's on the euro. I didn't know it. Sorry, but thank you. I really appreciate that. That's very big for me. I really, really do appreciate that. Let's see here. Hollywood's full of powerful people who have connections to the government. Totally. That's why most things are pro-government. Are you familiar with the theory that the Rikat structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, is the former location of Atlantis? If not, I'll check it out. Might be fun, I like the idea of Atlantis seeking beneath the sea, though. I like Atlantean myth. I mean, Tolkien used them. It's a fun idea. Robert E. Howard, of course, had like Sinking of Atlantis and wrote some stories with Atlantis. They were really good. If there was a novel about an ex-Muslim, it would be more interesting to make him unbeliever or true believer to Catholicism. Probably an unbeliever. I like the idea of unconditional election. I find it more compelling. That's me. But you do what you want to do, because if you're a Muslim, if you're a true believer of Islam and you're converted to Catholicism, what's converting you? What evidence is turning you against it? So usually you're going to be, from the perspective of the Catholic, you're going to be an unbeliever, and you're going to have to walk across some threshold to believe or disbelieve what you've been told. Yes, Negelsacks, the working cactantor, whatever. I never knew how to pronounce it, but it's like that's where Wurtla comes from, right? Or it's just it's like Cthulhu or Ra, Yog Saron. It's just a confounding of letters. So that's where I got that from. So the working incantor is it's a eldritch horror that's imprisoned in a sun in Marathon Infinity, which Marathon's a great gaming series, and you can play it for free. So if you want to play like a retro game like Doom, That I actually like it better than Doom, although it's harder in a lot of ways because the level design's kind of confusing compared to Doom. Doom is a little more straightforward. Then I do recommend Marathon. Marathon also, it's really dark, man. It's really dark. You're walking through like these abandoned space stations. Things are dark. You have a motion detector like from Aliens, so you hear an alien and you see like a red triangle moving across your screen. You're like, oh, where is he? And you're like spinning in circles, and then you don't see him because he's on a level below you, and you're like, oh, now he's aggroed on me. Where am I gonna find him? What do you think is the reason people believe in conspiracy theories? Because they don't have a firm. The main reason people believe in conspiracy theories is they don't have something else firm that replaces that. So conspiracy theories exist when you don't have like a firm model of the world that's resistant to like influence. So a lot of conspiracy theorists, they just don't have a firm idea of like what is real. So it's easier to be persuaded into sort of fantastical directions. Something have gone terribly awry. The power that I sought to study to control have been unleashed, an unpredictable chaos beyond my comprehension, and the chaos is hungry. In transmission. That's one of the little terminals, I think from Durandal. Because I think Durandal was like going back in time to study this Eldritch Horror. I don't remember exactly what part of the plot that was. For some reason, Keanu Reeves keeps appearing in my YouTube feed. Maybe I'm being conditioned for Reeves 2020. Keanu Reeves, I hear he's actually a really nice guy. So I knew Keanu Reeves' stepdad, actually, who's a producer in Hollywood and produced one of the Bill and Ted movies. So I knew him a couple years back. And Keanu has a reputation of being like very nice, but he doesn't really like being famous. Like he's uncomfortable with direct attention, and he's actually a very introverted dude, which tends to make people a little bit nice, What's your favorite cosmic entity from Lovecraft? I like Nyarlathotep. I'm trying to see. I have to stop. I feel like a kindergartner. Nyarlathotep. There we go. I don't often read these out loud, so it's hard. I like Cthulhu. I like Cthulhu. I just this idea of a dead being affecting dreams. I like Cthulhu, but they're all good. They're all variations of the same great theme. You've heard of Bulwer Lytton contest? I have not. Do you think that Mace Windu killing Sidious without the Senate's approval convinced Anakin to embrace the dark side more than the Chancellor's office did? That was George Lucas's original intent. And I think it did. I think it did in the movie. That's the effect that I got. Because what he saw was that Mace Windu was not willing to adhere to the Jedi Code. He says he has to be taken alive. And Mace says he's too dangerous to be left alive. Mace Windu is stepping over a threshold. He's not like obeying the code. And at that point, Anakin starts grasping for straws. I need him alive. Now it becomes a personal thing. And that's, once it becomes personalized in those few dialogue moments, then he steps over the edge. And he becomes a Sith Lord. Are you familiar with the Operation Northwoods? It was a now declassified U.S. conspiracy to fake Cuba shooting down a plane of American students. It almost happened, but JFK nixed it. I have heard of this, but I don't know enough details to comment. Sounds interesting, though. Oh, I missed a bunch of super chats. Let me get to these. 99 cents from Python Blender. Thank you. And another 99 cents from Python Blender. I wonder if Python Blender is a programmer. Python was one of the programming languages I tried to learn back in the day. It failed. Failed mostly because I didn't practice it enough. I learned enough Python to do like OpenRPG, and then I didn't learn much more. Prophet Mo, who doesn't submit, ain't that cheeky. Thank you, Kaku. Do you think Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was a true believer of Mormonism? That is a great question. So the question is, was he a liar, or did he actually believe the things he said? So let's go back to the either or from Chronicles of Narnia. Has Lucy ever given you reason in the past? Has she lied in the past? Well, Does Joseph Smith have a history of lying or deceiving people? There's your answer. Speaking of conspiracy theories, might be a good time to mention Flat Earth again. Yeah. Freemasons declared the Catholics their biggest enemy back in 1717. Yes, I'm Catholic, so the Freemason thing is right up my alley. Yeah, I get along with it. If you think about it, I mean, of course, Catholicism is going to be... I mean, Freemasonry is kind of a super religious order, right? Like a non-denominational religious order, and it's sort of more original version, and I don't know about it today. But Catholicism directly opposes that, because Catholicism says we are the universal faith. Like we are the ones who are actually in the universal faith, and so that which says that it has the faith which is not adhering to the real universal faith is, of course, heresy, right? And so naturally they're going to be enemies. It's very interesting to think about. Have you seen that there's a new Apocalypse Now coming out? Do you think it'll be closer to the original or Redux? I didn't know about a new Apocalypse Now cut. I'm very interested, though, because I like both the original and Redux. I like the original because it's tighter, and I like Redux because it's got a better descent into madness. You really feel like you're crazy by the end of the Redux because of all the wacky stuff that happens. Can you talk about the possibility of ghosts? I don't know. You know, are ghosts possible? I like the idea of them. I love telling ghost stories, but kind of like demons, I think their effect is not physical. And so what most people think of as ghosts is probably, like, I don't think our soul remains on this plane, but I think demons might be real. And it kind of, this is going to sound weird, but as I get older, I believe more in things like demonic possession, because there's just not really any other explanation for some of the insanity and evil that you see, you know? Demonic possession seems more plausible every day that I'm alive. I heard that the Flat Earth theory was created as a government test to see how susceptible people were to disinformation. That's what my book's about. It's not just that. It's actually to identify people. So people who are able to be convinced that the Earth is flat, they're being identified, and the conspiracy is why? Why is the government identifying and isolating these people who believe that the Earth is flat? Like, what's that about? Why are they doing that? But I will say, just as a counter to that conspiracy, the Flat Earth Society goes back to like the 1900s or the 1800s, I think. So it's actually pretty old. But the newer versions of it, yeah, it might be government conspiracy. I don't know. But that's the idea of the book, is that it is actually a conspiracy, and it's a conspiracy that's so effective the government no longer has to make the content. You know, other people believe in it so strongly they just keep repeating the same arguments to each other and building up the content base. And then they use all that, you know, people viewing the videos, they use that to isolate and target them because they are some kind of threat to the government that's not immediately obvious. And of course, the result of the plot is really that, you know, these people who are susceptible to Flat Earth are also susceptible to being convinced of something which is real. They're able to believe some things that are actually real, meaning they've rejected their government programming. Pulp Fiction is a non-believer archetype with Vincent Vega. Yes, that's a great one, actually. So you have Jules, who he doesn't get shot by the hand cannon at the beginning, and he has a faith conversion. He's like, I was spared for a reason. In other words, I've been elected into some service of God. I'm going to wander the earth until God puts me where he needs me to be, and I must give up my life of sin. He's a true believer. Then you have Vincent, who's like, you know, if you give that guy $1,500, I'm going to kill him on general principle. You know, it's just he doesn't believe. Now, what is the consequence of Vincent Vega not believing? He gets killed because he didn't believe in the election. He ends up in a situation where Bruce Willis's character kills him. And even though this is told out of order, we see the consequence of this. So we see the consequence before we get to that final scene of the diner, where we get to finally hash out all of the ideas, where Jules finally says, you know, I've had a faith conversion. I'm going to leave this life and I'm going to go somewhere else. By leaving his life and going somewhere else, he saved his life. And Vincent Vega, by not believing that it had been faith, ends up damning himself. So that's a great one from Geekdom there. That's actually a really good one. I didn't think of that one when I was coming up with this video. I think I missed another super chat from Delta Wolf. Joseph Smith was a liar and had a history of fraud. Let's see here. The story of Job is a horrible story and is a terrible way to show the mercy of God. I suggest you actually read it. But yeah, seriously, God lets a guy's life get completely ruined just to prove a point. That's not necessarily why it happens. But it's really just that what purpose does suffering serve? Because people often ask this, like, why does God allow suffering on the world? Well, it draws you closer to him, believe it or not. And also, we live in a fallen world, so suffering is part of being in a fallen, sinful world. Why would you expect God to relieve you of that which is part of your existence? You know, the human condition is one which is fallen and mortal. And only through faith are you relieved of those. Do you think Western Europe would have gone to dominate the world if it was conquered by Islam in the Middle Ages? No. I don't think so. But I don't know. I think what you would have, I don't know if you would have had colonialism the way that you had it. Because I think Islam would have probably viewed colonialism differently than how the Europeans viewed it. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible there would have had some kind of similar thing, but colonialism wasn't so much about spreading the faith, although the Catholic Church certainly took that as an opportunity to create missions all over the world, but was really about riches and gold and things like that. So I'm not sure. I think it would have been very different. I think it's an interesting idea for, if we want to do alternate history, like what if Europe was Muslim and they were, the struggle was not colonializing the world. It was like pushing east and trying to conquer China or something. Have you seen or read Neil Gaiman or Terry Pratchett's Good Omens? I saw the show and it's hilarious. I think you would love it. It's about an angel and a demon, unlikely friendship. I haven't seen it. You agree with George Washington's view that political parties inherently turn harmful in time and that America should have no parties due to their harmful effect? I think I think George Washington was engaging in wishful thinking and having no parties. Parties are just another way of creating a tribe within a political system, right? You have a party, and the party hopefully has some basic set of principles. So in a parliamentary system, actually parties work better than they do in the American system. Because in the American system, we have this first past the post thing, which inherently creates two parties. So if he really believed that political parties were inherently harmful, then we created the wrong republic for that. Should have gone with even a direct democracy might have still had parties. But parties also were less important back even with the Federalist, Anti-Federalists, they were less important than they are now. Because of everything, there weren't lobbyists. Lobbyists weren't as much of a thing. Have you heard about the theory that Bush's family tied a Reagan shooter? I haven't. Neil Bush, George H.W. Bush's son, met with John Hinckley Jr.'s brother a day before the shooting happened. I hadn't heard of that. That's interesting. Joseph Smith was a liar. He had a history of fraud and conning people. Yes. There was such a thing as the U.S. Anti-Masonic Party in the 1800s. I didn't know that. Demonic possession explains a lot of SJW behavior. That's kind of how I feel. More than that, if somebody's super resistant to, it's like people still believe in Russiagate. That's a lot of resistance. It's one thing to be like, I don't like Trump. Okay, I get that. I don't like who he is. I don't like his policies. Great. It's like, he's a Russian agent. It's like, why would you say the person who's probably more powerful than the Russian president would be an agent of the Russian president? That doesn't make sense. That's like saying, it just doesn't make any sense. And there's no evidence of it. One could say that Christianity is just one big conspiracy theory about the majority of the world's people and governments being under the influence of otherworldly entities. I don't think so at all, necessarily, because, in fact, I don't think so at all. Otherworldly entities, governments are not necessarily full of people who are demon possessed, especially back in the Middle Ages, and people didn't really consider that. If you read something like The Prince, there's this idea that rulers need to view faith differently than the peasantry because faith will prevent you from holding power and maintaining the safety of the peasantry. Will a novel written from Arvin's point of view, South Vietnamese Army, be interesting? It sucks that no people don't tend to care about their story. What kind of reaction would that provoke? I don't know. The ARV ends. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what kind of reaction we get. I just have no idea. Marina Sirtis recently said that it's oxymoronic to be both a Republican and a Star Trek fan. Do you agree or disagree? And if you disagree, what would be a good rebuttal? Well, I'd say being a fan of anything doesn't necessarily make you part of a political faction. You know, if I'm a fan of the Ferengi, what does that make me? I like the Ferengi. I think they're a cool race. Does that mean I can't be a Republican? Seems like they're like a caricature of capitalists. So I think that's a bunch of garbage. But people come out with this stuff from time to time. Gene Roddenberry was like a secular humanist. So no Christians as Trek fans. None of that's allowed, too. If you weren't a secular humanist, atheist kind of person, then you can't be a Trek fan. That's nonsense. But now Star Trek believed in a future where there was no scarcity. Therefore, the reality of economics didn't apply, right? In a future where there's no scarcity, obviously you don't need a capitalistic system. Like there's unlimited resources. It's not socialist either. It's just it's beyond those economic systems because of unlimited resources. So the idea that you have to be a Democrat if you're a Star Trek fan is nonsense. The whole point of the post-scarcity idea is that you don't have to be bogged down by ideas of economics in order to think about the human spirit, the humanist ideas. George says, Story of Job is one of the things that make Abraham religions different from the Eastern religions, which believe in karma. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Do you think the book of Ecclesiastes anticipated the widespread nihilism that we have now? Yes, because it's always been in us. You know, there's nothing new under the sun. When he says there's nothing new under the sun, it doesn't mean in 2,000 years it's going to be upon us. It's always been with us. There's always been a cycle of nihilism and great faith. With great struggle comes great faith. With great prosperity comes nihilism, because you aren't able to contextualize and understand what you have. So the people who engage with the greatest struggle are also the most faithful. They're the closest to God. I'm reminded of this song by Woods of Ypres, this Canadian doom metal band that is no more because David Gold died in an accident. The guy who did it for its entire existence. And he wrote a song called Traveling Alone. And in Traveling Alone, he's part of the song, he's talking to somebody who's checking his passport. And he's asking, do you have anything to declare? And he says, I have nothing to declare. And he basically says, like, I have no faith in God. And he says, because David Gold had gone and worked in the Middle East in various oil industries, worked in Kuwait. I see the evidence of God in the people of that area. I see the evidence of God in the people of Kuwait and people of Saudi Arabia because of their world. But in the West, there's no evidence of God. There's this schism where it's like, of course, I see the evidence of God in the people who are not of the West. I see no evidence of God in the men of the West is one of the lyrics. So it's a very, it's a great song. You should check out the band if you haven't ever heard of them. And you like doom metal. Let's see here. Regarding your comments about Islam and colonialism, Muslims conquered parts of Africa and brutally enslaved many Africans centuries before Europeans did, and far more harshly. They also did this. Now, the word slave is like Slav, right? From Greek's enslavement of Eastern Europeans. So, slavery was considered a universal human condition until we decided it didn't need to be, and we got rid of it. So, I don't know. The blaming of white people for slavery is always, I don't blame Muslims more for it either. Like, they just engaged in what people had always done, which is the slave trade. And what's unique is that we got rid of the slave trade. That's what should be actually of interest, is somehow there was a moral consciousness elevation that got rid of the slave trade. Decided that didn't need to be a human condition. People didn't have to be slaves. Why do you think people are still religious even though more and more science is showing us that God isn't real? It's because God is real. And science has ignored like basic, you can look this stuff up. This stuff goes back to Aristotle. Basic principles of the way matter interacts indicates that there's a God. Aristotle proved it. Thomas Aquinas proved it. And there's actually 5 different Thomas Aquinas proofs of God. You can look them up on yourself online. I can do content on them sometime, but they're very compelling. Because the problem with science saying that there's no God is that there's always an infinite regression. There's one. And there's also multiple other things. But infinite regression is a big one. So one of the things that occurs when you say that there's no God is that basically it's elephants all the way down. It's turtles all the way down. There can't be a prime mover because it's turtles all the way down. And you can't avoid it. Unlike the Federation or the Klingons or the Cardassians or most of the species in the Alpha Quadrant, the Ferengi made money on both sides during the Dominion War. That's capitalism. I don't know about that. I mean, yeah, in a way. Capitalism is really just that they privately held things. But they're kind of a caricature of capitalism. They're kind of super greedy. Buyer beware. First rule of acquisition: no good deed goes unpunished. I love it. I think it's very fun. I love the Ferengi. I love the space capitalists. DS9 give color to a mostly bland universe by adding counterpoints to the nearly utopian Federation we all love. That's why one of the reasons I like Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine is probably my favorite of the Star Trek series at this point. Do you consider it bad to use demon names for real-world lore in dark fantasy or horror? I'm curious because I like using real-world legends in one of my books. I don't think it's bad. I don't think there's like bad juju. I don't believe in that. But you have to decide that for yourself. Excuse me. Will you ever consider doing more guitar-related videos? Yeah, I can. I'll probably do more in the future at some point if I can figure out like a schedule and like a kind of a set number of things to do. The thing is, they're really, really not profitable. They don't make any money. So when you're looking at your time and how you're going to spend your time, that's one thing you have to consider is that if you're spending your time on something that doesn't economically benefit you, why are you doing it? I would do it just for charitable reasons. And that's really why I started the channel with guitar. I wanted people to have information for how to play guitar so that they wouldn't have to spend their money on bad teachers and things like that. So anyone can play guitar as long as you have an internet access. That was kind of like my altruistic dream. But it's hard, it's hard to prioritize things. Do you think that societies often ping-pong back and forth between prudish and overly socially liberal due to people feeling one extreme right in the open arms of the opposite? Yeah, that's probably a pretty poignant idea. Because you have the Romantics and then you have the Victorians, right? You have the modern flappers and then you have the like Bible Belt. The greatest generation, highly faithful. You have the hippies, and then you have, well, in this case, we actually end up with like nihilistic Xers, but they do tend to ping pong back and forth. The Enlightenment, which is like pure reason, gave way to the Romantics, pure emotion, So yeah, you do tend to ping pong back and forth. Lots of things are reactions against things. That's the way that things tend to go down. Shane Killian did a debunking of Thomas Aquinas. I don't think I would call it that. Which show is in a worse state, Doctor Who or Star Trek? I don't watch either one, so I don't know. I haven't watched any of the new Star Trek series, and I don't really intend to. Mostly because I'm a huge Star Trek fan, but how should I put this? I didn't want to do a paywall to watch Star Trek, and then every person who I thought would have the same opinion as me was like, this is terrible. So I'm probably not going to watch it. Ready, set, go. Taking a break from outlining my novel for a good listen. Have a Coke Zero on me. Cheers. Thank you. Thank you for the $5. Ready, set, go. All right, it's getting on close to 8 o'clock, and I actually have to hang it up, not just because my voice is tired. So thanks so much for watching and listening. The new book, which is called Voices of the Void, you can get it right now. I'm going to go ahead and paste this link again. If you join my mailing list, you get that book for free. You can read it. And let me know what you think. If you're not into horror, and there is like some gore in it and stuff, if you're not into that, that's okay. It's going to be a departure from my normal fantasy stuff, and I just kind of want to see what people think about it and whether the audience digs it. So thanks so much, and I will see you guys next time.